Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to our monthly SIL Global's Language Technology webinar. My name is Kent Schroeder, and I will be your host for this seminar webinar. And I will be having Doug Higbee will be assisting me. And our presenter will be Tom Bogle. Tom Bogle is a software developer with SIL Global. He has been working on Say More, Glyssen, HearThis, and even is contributing to Paratext 10 as well. So he's a very experienced software developer as well. His topic is going to be audio scriptures with Glyssen and HearThis. So we'll be covering two software topics as well. Now, our presenter will have 1 hour per presenting, then 30 minutes for Q&A. But during his presentation, after his PowerPoint, he's going to open it up for some questions before he goes into his demo. So beware of that. But I would like you to use the Q&A box for entering your questions and comments, and we will address them during the various Q&A sessions as well. Thank you all for coming, and I want to welcome Tom and turn it over to him right now.
Thank you, Kent. There you go. I think you should be able to see my slides, right?
Yep, you're good.
Yep. Great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm going to be, as Ken said, sharing about the Glyssen and HearThis software. And the reason I'm doing the two together is that they can be made to work together in some kind of fun and interesting ways. And so they're both software packages that are designed to help with the production of audio scripture. And so that's why we're combining the two pieces of software into a single presentation this morning. So let me start with just a brief introduction to Glyssen. Glyssen is software that helps produce scripts for dramatized audio recording of scripture. Glyssen was started as a joint effort between SIL with the IMS department involved and Faith Comes by Hearing. Faith Comes by Hearing has moved on, or at least mostly moved on, and they're using some software that they've produced internally now for most of their dramatized scripture production. But Glyssen is still a piece of software that is being used by teams in different parts of the world to prepare scripts for audio, dramatized audio. And the Glyssen can get its source text either directly from Paratext. If you're a Paratext user, your Paratext projects will appear as options to be opened in Glyssen. Also, Glyssen can access text release bundles, which typically come from the Digital Bible Library. And so for users who are not part of a Paratext project, or where the Paratext project has been completed and released and published on the Digital Bible Library, that is a great way to get started with Glyssen, accessing the text. Basically, what Glyssen does is it takes the text, it helps you figure out who is speaking the different parts. Most of the time, it can do that automatically. There's just a handful of places where it needs a little user interaction to be able to figure out who's speaking, and then it will help you come up with an ideal cast for doing the recording project, and then it'll produce a script which you can use in a couple of different ways. But one way that you can use that script is to record using HearThis. So that's the main thing I'll be talking about today, though there are other options and ways you can use the script for recording. So a couple of places or situations in which Glyssen is particularly beneficial, as opposed to just contacting Faith Comes by Hearing and saying, hey, come do a recording project for us. So some of the places where you might want to consider using Glyssen are in early on in the project, when you're trying to evaluate if a dramatized recording is even the right thing. So in some cultures, some people, some audiences find the dramatized scripture really engaging and interesting, and it works really well. And in other situations, they find it distracting, and they just would rather have scripture read by a single narrator. And so Glyssen gives you the opportunity to do a small trial of a dramatized recording and get it out there and kind of evaluate whether or not that is an appropriate way to present audio scripture. Glyssen is also really useful for doing smaller portions where it doesn't really warrant bringing in a whole outside team to and all the equipment and everything to do a full-on New Testament or Bible. It's a great tool for kind of doing early and often publishing. If you're going to be doing your recordings kind of piecemeal over time, obviously bringing in a outside recording team to do that, every couple of months or whatever isn't really feasible. And so those are some of the places where Glyssen is really helpful. Glyssen can also be used in situations where there's security concerns, where bringing in an outside team or a lot of equipment might raise too much visibility to a project. And so in that situation, Glyssen can be used by locals. It's also a tool that can be used where local ownership is really of interest to the project team, rather than bringing in outsiders. Glyssen also is very flexible in doing casting. So if you want to have a particularly small cast or a particularly large cast, Glyssen will help you fit the cast to the project, minimizing the number of places where a person might end up sounding like they're talking to themselves in scripture. And that's particularly true if you're only doing maybe one or two books. Then it can actually optimize the cast for the project rather than saying we need 11 people and we're going this is how it's broken out in the New Testament. So that's one of the ways that the Glyssen is especially useful. Or in situations where you maybe have a village chief or a prominent person in that wants to be part of the recording project, where that would be helpful for the recording project, but they don't have a bunch of time to fill the roles that would be kind of the normal roles for a particular actor. Glyssen allows for assigning an actor to do a cameo role where they just do a few things and they can kind of get their name in the project and get their reputation attached to the project, but not have to do a lot of recording. And then Glyssen also allows you to, on a book by book basis, say whether you want the book to be dramatized or narrator only. So it's very much a flexible piece of software, not a one size fits all kind of thing. And so those are some of the specific situations where Glyssen might be really helpful. I wanted to mention Glyssen is currently only Windows software, so that is one of the requirements. You have Windows software, and it is localized into a handful of languages. But it does require to really somebody has to know one of the languages it's localized into in order to be able to really use it effectively, and particularly for the disambiguation phase. Even the languages it's localized into there's a lot of the character names are not yet localized into most of the languages. So having somebody that knows English well enough to be able to say, "Oh yeah, this is that character," is kind of a beneficial thing for Glyssen. All right, let me now switch gears and talk just a little bit about HearThis. So HearThis is a audio scripture recording platform. So this is a place where you actually do the recording. HearThis was initially started as a very low end rice farmer software. So for users who have little or no computer experience, in a matter of a couple of hours, they can be trained to use HearThis to do their own recording on a project. So that's the kind of the origin of HearThis. It was really designed for publish early and often methodologies, and later HearThis was also expanded to be able to read Glyssen scripts. So I will demonstrate that later. But once you've created a script in Glyssen, you can open that in HearThis and actually use HearThis to do the recording with different voice actors doing different parts. So here this can get its source text from the same places that the Glyssen can from Paratext or from text release bundle. It can also, as I mentioned, access a Glyssen script file for multiple voice recording, and then it can also just use local USFM files. So for a person who can't or doesn't want to install Paratext, but has access to the USFM files from Paratext or from any other source that produces USFM files, it can access those files directly to pull in the text. And here this basically works by bringing in the text and essentially breaking it up sentence by sentence for recording purposes. Some of the benefits of HearThis are improved naturalness, the ability for a recordist to record over and over and over again, and not feel the pressure necessarily of an external person who's come in and is only going to be there for 3 weeks. Just gives them the ability to keep recording over and over again until they're comfortable with the way it sounds. And that lower pressure bar has some teams have reported that they really think that that actually improves the quality of the recording, even though maybe the recording equipment isn't necessarily as high end as what an outside team would bring in, and they don't have the same level of experience in doing audio processing. That the lower pressure scenario of being able to record for yourself actually is helpful for quality in some situations. Here, this is also really good for doing draft testing. Many teams use HearThis as part of their translation process. What we know is that when people have to both record and then listen to what's been recorded, it improves the quality of the translation. So rather than saying, hey, this has all been completely consultant checked, it's finalized, it's ready to be published, now let's record it. You can use HearThis as you're working on the drafting process, and use it to record things that are not in final form, and listen to and hear and notice places where the text is a little rough. As with Glyssen here, this is useful for evaluating appropriate audio products. So you can do early testing of different recording, whether you're doing dramatized or just narrator only. And also even being able to kind of say, okay, hey, what should we be targeting? Should we be targeting Scripture App Builder? Should we be targeting specific Scripture audio players? Here, this has a bunch of different export options, and so you can kind of test some of those different products and see what products are going to work well in the end. And because here this does work with a live project, it allows you to do publish early and often, as I mentioned before, so that you can get those recordings out there for testing purposes. And it can be used as part of your scripture checking process, even with community checking, because you can work with people that can't read but can, and so you can test the comprehensibility of audio scriptures as well. And also as with Glyssen, here this is really a key product in establishing local ownership. People can do this without really any outside help at all, and so that's one of the main benefits of HearThis. So HearThis works fully functionally on Windows. It's mainly a Windows piece of software, but there's also a HearThis for Android companion product that you can install on a phone or Android tablet, and use that for the recording. You still need a Windows mothership to be able to sync your recordings back to and do the publishing part. So the Windows side will get the text and break it all up and create the kind of the script, and then on Android devices you can record and then sync back up to the to hear this and then publish from there. So that makes sense. And there is a new version of the Android app in the pipeline. We're working on getting that out. There's a few rough spots with the syncing between Windows and Android, but we are hoping to address those and get a modern Android app up soon. And then once that's out, we also hope to do some additional improvements to the Android app. So I'm going to pause at this point, and just um,
You want to
um,
address some of the questions that have been put out
yeah,
there
yeah,
already?
I would love to go ahead and kind of take some questions at this point before diving into the demos, just so I can make sure that those are, any preliminary questions are addressed, and also know what we want to talk about during the demo. So.
Okay. Okay, go through the questions. How would Glyssen interface be localized into other languages? Is it something that has to be done by language technology?
Great question. So both Glyssen and HearThis are have crowd-in projects, so they can be localized using crowd-in. The what the normal process then is, once something has been localized into another language on crowd-in, we will pull those localizations down and release them during the next whenever we're ready to do another release of the software. But you can also pull those down and install them locally as so that they can be done even before the next release of the software.
Yeah. So how many languages has it been localized already?
Glyssen is, let's see. So there's a long list here. Most of these, when you pick them, it will tell you, hey, it's not really localized into this language. Uh, so there's a whole bunch of languages that there may be like a tiny handful of strings that are localized. But if you pick one of the ones that is not complete in, you'll actually get a little prompt that says, "Hey, are you available to help localize this?" Or at least we will get a notification through analytics saying somebody's interested in this language. So. But yeah, so Glisten is in English and Spanish, and actually, let's- uh, I will go and check and see just exactly which languages it has. It is primarily localized in. Um, Here we go. English, Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Chinese. It's both simplified and traditional Chinese are the languages that some reasonable amount of effort has gone into localizing. Um, I know Spanish is very, very nearly complete, and French is pretty good, and then it probably starts to drop off from there.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Next question. Um, if used on a live project, is there a place where it warns the text has been changed since you last recorded, akin to PT Paratext flags in the back translation panel?
Yes. Okay. So let me talk actually about both pieces of software. So Glycerin does do that, and it does give you a way to sync up, and it attempts to reapply the disambiguation decisions that you've made previously, as much as it can. So it is with Glisten, it is definitely not as easy or as smooth if your project is in a big state of flux. But it does attempt to do that and helps you update the project. Here, this actually has a well, relatively new feature. It's been out for a couple of years now, I think. called check for problems. That's a pretty sophisticated process that will look for all the places where your text is different from when it was first recorded, highlight those and let you decide whether it needs to be re-recorded or if it's okay as it is, or and adjust shift recordings to the right place so they match up with the text and things like that. So
Okay, thank you. Next question. Here, this Android and Paratext Lite. Can Paratext Lite clear the need for a Windows mothership?
no, cannot.
Okay,
They hear this Android product is really just a recording platform. It doesn't
okay,
have any way of accessing the text directly.
okay, thank you. Okay. Does
That
it
might not be the
record?
right answer, but that is the answer.
Okay. Does it record one sentence at a time? Does that produce natural sound recordings after it's combined?
Maybe. That depends. That is definitely one of the things that the team needs to kind of, work on and kind of figure out. There is a new feature that is not yet released, though. I will try to demonstrate it a little bit
Mm.
today, maybe. But there is here. This has a new feature coming out that for doing both sound leveling and adjusting the cadence to avoid like long awkward pauses or putting things too close together. Um, so it is always possible, especially with like really short sentences in here. This it is possible to say, I want to record these two sentences together and just like skip the next segment. And here this does have a new feature that allows you to say, for this passage, I want to record it verse by verse rather than sentence by sentence. That can help with both really long sentences, like sometimes some genealogies will not use any sentence ending punctuation for the entire genealogy. And so then you end up with something that's like impossible to record in one go, especially with all those crazy names. And then sometimes, if you have sentences, a verse that has two or three short sentences, doing verse by verse recording actually will help with that naturalness as well. And so you can now in here this for any range of verses, say I'm going to do these sentence by sentence instead of, I'm sorry, verse by verse instead of doing it sentence by sentence. But for sure, if you get, especially like you get into some of the Pauline epistles where you have a sentence that goes across three verses, doing it verse by verse is not necessarily ideal as long as you're able to record it and not make mistakes for the whole sentence. Doing it sentence by sentence definitely is more natural than doing verse by verse in those situations when you can do that well.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Next question. How are the Hear This recordings managed? Where and how are they stored for safekeeping, sharing, and distribution?
Great question. So they're stored on a local computer. The documentation does explain what you should include in your backup to make sure that they're included in your backup strategy. They're if you're for the technical people, they're stored under program data. Um, so that should be included in your backup strategy to make sure that the files are not lost. But they're not stored on the cloud natively by HearThis. And HearThis also does not have any built-in archiving uh, like Flex does or say more. And maybe it should, but it doesn't currently.
Yeah, but at the same time, it does provide multiple options for exporting those files so that a user doesn't typically have to like go open File Explorer and find all the files and do anything with them because they can export directly to different uh, tools, right?
Right, right. Yeah. So I guess I was addressing mainly the safekeeping part of it. But yes, for sharing distribution, here this does have an export feature that allows you to target specific devices or probably one of the most exciting things that people do now is Scripture App Builder, and here this has option to export in a format that Scripture App Builder can consume easily.
Okay. Okay, Tom, that ends our questions for now.
Okay,
So I
great.
guess you can begin your demo.
All right, so I will start with demoing Glyssen, and yeah, you should be able to see that. Okay, so let me just start by yeah, by kind of showing you how you would open a new project. So in the open project screen, you see all the if you have Paratext installed, you see all the Paratext projects that you have on your system, which I have more than a few. And so if you're picking one that you've never haven't started before, it will say under the recording project here, it will say recording project not started. And so I'm going to go ahead and pick this one. And then Paratext will say, well, Glyssen will ask Paratext, is this project ready for recording? And the kind of the baseline is you should have run the basic checks in Paratext for markers, quotations, and chapter verse numbers. And those should pass cleanly before trying to start a Glyssen project. Um, and so Glyssen will let you know, hey, this project is not really ready. You can still go ahead and do it, and it might work just fine, but that's a kind of warning is like if those checks don't pass, you're likely to have problems in your Glyssen project. So then once you've opened a project, you can open up project settings. Whoops, coming up on screen that you can't see. And then so here you can put in your recording project name. This audio stock number is really a thing mainly for Faith Comes by Hearing, but basically that can be any unique ID or whatever that's useful to you. Glyssen in concert with Paratext or the settings in the text release bundle will try to figure out what your quote mark settings are. Usually you don't have to touch those, but if it's guessed wrong or if you haven't got that set up right in Paratext yet, you can go into quote mark settings and actually use that to help you discover whether or not these are in fact the quotation marks used in this project. So there's a place where you can specify your font if you need to use a different font while you're working in Glyssen. And there is a place here where you can specify how you want to do chapter announcements. Whether you're for each chapter you're going to say the book name and the chapter number, or just the chapter number. And so then it will put out in the script based on your preferences. You also have the option of whether or not to announce the first chapter in a book. So you might just say the Gospel of John, and then you start reading it, and then when you get chapter 2, you say chapter 2. So those are some of the different options that you have for how to announce chapters and book names. Under the reference text here, you can specify whether you want to use the English or the Russian reference text. If you are a Faith Comes by Hearing user or you're me, you'll have a bunch of other choices here. Sadly, we have not been able to get unencumbered versions of these other languages to use as reference texts. There's a bit of processing that needs to go into preparing a reference text. So English and Russian are the only two that are completely unencumbered. Yeah, so that's a little unfortunate, I think. And then finally, under script options, you have the option of saying whether or not you're going to have the narrator read book introductions, section headings, book titles, and chapters, or whether you want to have somebody else do that. So you can say, I want all the book titles and chapters to be read by a male actor or by a female actor or by somebody else other than the narrator, doesn't matter their gender. Or you can say, no, we're not going to do those at all. We're not going to read book titles and chapters. And so you have those options for all these things, whether or not to have them broken out as just as separate characters or separate recordist or the same recordist. Okay, and then the next thing to do when you're starting a project is to choose which books. And here we're being told that because these books haven't passed the basic checks, none of them are included automatically. If all the books in your project have been have passed checks, then they will automatically be included by default. But then you can choose which books to include right here. So, and if I want to do, say, an Old Testament only thing, I'll be warned again that, hey, these have not passed checks, but it'll let me do it anyway. And now I've got these Old Testament books. So this project doesn't have all the Old Testament, but of the ones that are there, they're all included. And then the next part of the process is to go in and identify who is speaking. So Glyssen thinks about that for a minute. And so then it's going to come up with this interface, and I'm going to switch to a different project now because I don't read this script and because there's a lot to be done here. Right. This will allow me to illustrate this without maybe quite as much confusion. Okay, so in this view, you can basically align the parts of the vernacular text to match up with the reference text. And I'm gonna show you kind of two ways to do this process. I personally find, for the most part, and of course, I don't speak this language, but I find for the most part that this method of doing it, where you're aligning it to the English, is actually easier for me. For sure, if you have somebody who's not really familiar with English, this would be a little harder to do. But it does allow for the kind of the maximum benefit of Glyssen. If you're going to be recording with HearThis, this is completely optional. Knowing what the English is doesn't really matter. And HearThis, you're never going to see this English. But if you're if you're basically exporting this to like Excel files, the English will appear in the script, so that if you're going to be working, say, with a recording team who doesn't speak the vernacular, they'll be able to see and follow along as you're going through the recording process. But basically what you're doing here is you're saying who's speaking, and what does it correspond to in English. Most of the time in Glyssen, as you go through this, all you have to do is click apply. It's going to get it right. But then you get to one like this one here, where you can see there's no English text for this thing here. So the guess is that this is a scripture text or scripture quote. So what's happened here is, in the English, we have a single quote that covers the entirety of verse 18, and it's all one sentence. And in the Acoli, what's going on here? We have verse 18. Okay, I see. There's more verse 18 here. So it looks like what's happened is, in Acoli, the scripture quote is this much, and then there's this part here that is, oh, that's the section head. Okay. What's going on here? I think what it is, we just, because of the sentence break, we just need to cut that and paste it in here. Right. Okay. And so then I don't know if I got that right because I can't read this language, but let's just assume that's right and move on. Okay. So here, in English, verse 1 has the narrator part, and verse 2 has John the Baptist speaking. But in the Acoli, the word saying is actually in verse 2, not in verse 1. So all we have to do there is cut that out and put it in here and say, yeah, that's the narrator speaking that, and we move on. All right, so that's kind of how you would use this particular view where you're aligning it to the reference text. The alternative is to go into this view here where you're just identifying who's speaking. And so then you look at this section, this part here where it says this in the Acoli, and you say, is that the narrator or Jesus? And this is where, for me, without being able to see the English, that's harder for me to know because I'm like, I don't know, and I'm not sure what they're saying. But if somebody spoke this language, they would be able to quickly look at this text and say, oh, okay, yeah, that's Jesus speaking, and they could even this delivery thing is there as kind of coaching prompts for doing the recording. And again, those will not appear in here this, but they do appear in the script if you use like an export to an Excel script and are working with a recording team. And so then I can assign that and move on. And basically, when you complete that whole process, then you'll be ready to start doing the casting process. And what I'm going to do for this project here is I'm going to just go and do Jude. And this will also illustrate how Glyssen can be used for a really small sample project or sample. So if you're just going to say, hey, we just want to record the book of Jude, there's not a lot going on in Jude. And so again, I don't know exactly where this is broken up in the text here, but this is all narrator speaking this, and so I apply that, and then here we have Michael the Archangel speaking, and that's already good, and then we get here, and again, that's just fine. That's Enoch speaking, and we get down here, and then in this one we have the option of saying, well, this is really a quote from the apostles. Do we want to dramatize that or not? And so we can say, yeah, I want to dramatize. I want to actually have the apostles, a character doing the apostles, speak this part. Okay, and now it says, hey, you've aligned everything to the reference text. You're ready to go, and then you can go into this cast size planning thing. And in this project, I had already like set up a whole bunch of different actors, but the Glyssen will help you kind of figure out what's an ideal cast. Since I've now brought it down to just the Book of Jude, I can say I want to do it. I just really don't have very many people that are available to speak, so I'm going to just do the smallest possible cast. And I just need 4 men, and then it will generate a cast for me, and I can then pick who are the people that are going to speak those parts, and I can go into my voice actor list, and I like I say I have all these people set up here, but you can actually pick real names of real people in your community that are going to do these things and say this is going to be recorded by Andre and so forth. And then over here, you can pick who's going to do this. So I'm going to have Andre do the disciples. And you can also lock an actor. So once if an actor has done his parts or whatever, and you no longer want that actor to be assigned to anything else, you can lock them to say this actor is doing exactly these parts and that's it. So anyway, that's kind of the general gist of how Glyssen works. Let me see if there are any questions about that before we move on to hear this.
Okay. I have a few questions. Okay. Biblical has a variety of open Bible projects which are free CC license texts. Could these be used as a reference text for Glyssen and the person?
Yeah, I
And
think the answer is probably. And there was I had in mind to kind of try to do some of that. Like I said, there's a bunch of processing that has to be done to turn a Bible into a reference text. And Glycerin honestly just has kind of dropped off my high priority development tasks. And so but yeah, I think that it could be, but they can't be done. It has to be pre-processed to do that. And so that's the the missing link there.
okay. And then one more. Are there any known limits on the scripts that Glycerin can work with? Latin, Daguerreography,
No,
Arabic.
I'm not aware of any limitations. It does handle right to left scripts, complex scripts. It is. I don't. You may have noticed it came up a little slow with that Old Testament, the Pashto project. I do know that the rendering. This is just a Windows thing, but the rendering for some complex scripts, and particularly I think right to left scripts, is considerably slower, and so you will notice a slowdown with some scripts. But I don't think there's any actual limitations on scripts that are not handled.
Okay, thank you. That's all the questions we have at this time, Tom.
All right. Well, I'm gonna close Glisten, and this is here this. Um, so the general way that you work in here this is um, going through you know whatever book or chapter you want to work on. You go through and you record bit by bit. Um, and the ones that are underlined, there's it has two color schemes. So this is the high contrast color scheme, great for presenting, maybe a little harder on the eyes. I like it because this is my favorite color green. But the ones that have the bar colored with that highlight color are blocks that have already been recorded. And then the ones that don't have that are ones that have not been recorded. And so you'll see, like for this one, I can't play it because it hasn't been recorded. And to record, you just press the record button and hold it down, or you can use the space bar, hold down the space bar while you record. And you hold it down and say, Vio Dios que era bueno. Okay, and then I can listen to it. Vio Dios que era bueno. I'm not sure if my audio is coming through, but it recorded what I
It
said.
it did.
Okay, great. So so that's the general way, and then if a person doesn't like the way it sounded, they just press the record button and say it again. Y vio Dios que era bueno. And you can do that over and over and over again until you're happy with the way it sounds, and then you can move on to the next one. Okay, and this one's already been recorded, and so you could review that. That is the main interface for Hear This. If you have a long sentence, then you can't get through it all without making mistakes. You can go in here to record long lines and parts, and you can record part of it and then record the next part of it. Optionally, you can kind of plan ahead and say, this is the part I'm going to do as part one. Después dijo Dios, produzca la tierra hierba verde, hierba que dé semilla. Después dijo Dios, produzca la tierra hierba verde, hierba que dé semilla. Árbol de fruto que dé fruto según su género, que su semilla esté en él sobre la tierra. And then now I can listen to the two parts together. Dijo Dios, produzca la tierra hierba verde, hierba que dé semilla. Árbol de fruto que dé fruto según su género, que su semilla esté en él sobre la tierra. And then I can say, yep, that sounds great. Once I've done that, it now becomes a single recording. I can't, if I go back in here, it's no longer two parts. It's all one thing. So This is just a way of getting the two things together, kind of a one-time shot to record long lines in parts. Um, let's see. Let me show you the check for problems mode. So this mode can be hidden if using administrative settings. So if you're administrator on the Hear This project, you can say, "Hey, I don't want my recordist to even see this mode because I don't want them to accidentally click it and get confused and not know what they're doing." So for people that are very new to computers, you can just lock things down and say, "You all your job is just do the recording," and then as an administrator, you can come in and check for problems and see where things are different. Um, so here I am in Genesis 1 verse 7, and this sentence here has the text of the block has changed since the clip was recorded. So it used to say Luego dijo Dios all this, but now it says this here, and so it shows you the parts that have changed. This little snippet in white is the same. Well, it's not even the same verse. So something has gotten off in the way this is recorded. So I could look and say, hey, is this next clip the actual one that was recorded for that? And I could shift things around, or I could just say, hey, you know what, this is we just need to re-record this thing. So these are if it's for a nearby block, I can go open the shift clips tool and find the one that actually has the right recording and move it into the right place, or I can just say, no, I'm going to re-record it. In some situations, the only change to the text may just be some like a comma was added or removed or a misspelling was fixed. In those cases, you don't have to re-record it as long as it sounds right. You can just say, no, this is fine. Just use it as it is. So I think that's unless there's more questions about that, maybe that's all I'm going to show in that because there's a lot you get into. But that's kind of how that mode works. Let me just show real briefly the export. So if you're targeting Scripture App Builder or one of these specific devices, you do this. These last three options are basically different for whatever purpose you're wanting to use these. You can just create a folder of these different formats. And then you can pick whether to export all the books in the project or only the current book. And you can also choose whether or not to have the label files included, which are very useful for Scripture App Builder. And you can include labels for phrase level clips if you want to. So, yeah, that's the export process, and I think it will tell you if you try to export and you haven't dealt with all the problems that are identified and checked for problems, it will tell you that before you export, so you can say whether or not you want to do that. And then it will go through and for any chapter, so you can see it skip some chapters here. Some of those chapters I don't have anything recorded in this project, so it doesn't produce audio for anything that's not recorded. And then I also did want to just quickly, this has not yet been released, but this is a new option in exporting sound files where you can choose to normalize the volume, do some noise reduction, and then you can constrain the pauses between sentences, paragraphs, sections, and chapters to be within a particular range. So what it will do is if you cut off the recording really quickly at the end and started really quickly in the next one, it will add some silence. It is not if you're into audio stuff, it's not zeros. It's good sounding silence. Um, so it won't sound dead, it will sound quiet. And then if you left too long of pauses, then it will constrain it on the other end and actually trim off some of the silence. So you can pick very, very tightly constrained and say, I want, you can make the minimum and maximum the same, in which case you'll have exactly the same amount of silence between every verse or between every sentence or between every paragraph. Not verse, sentence, paragraph, section. Probably you don't necessarily want to or need to have it constrained to that level. You might actually it might actually sound a little bit more natural to have a little bit of variation, but you can play with that and figure out what sounds good in your language. And there are some defaults put in, but the what's going to sound good in your language is very much specific to your language. So that will require a little bit of fiddling to figure out what sounds good. I don't know when that's going to be released, but I hope soon. Um, and then let me just show you real quickly the settings. So in here, you can pick certain styles that you want to have included or excluded. I think by default in here, we don't record section headings, but you can choose to include those. And you can also this is where I mentioned before that you can pick certain ranges of scripture that will be recorded by verse rather than by sentence. Um, and then here's where if you don't like the bright green, you can switch to the normal color scheme. Or vice versa. So if you're doing a presentation of HearThis in a context where the lighting isn't great or you don't have a really good projector or whatever, the high contrast color scheme will be beneficial to you. It will show up better on a screen from a projector. And you can also the settings protection thing is the thing I was mentioning that you can lock things down so that your recordists who are not necessarily sophisticated computer users will not get distracted and click the wrong things. So you can choose to hide the settings, and you can require a password. The password is just a hard-coded password. You don't get to pick your own password. The password is H7 ear this. And it is available online. So the purpose of this is not security. The purpose of this is to protect against users who might make changes to the settings or get lost in check for problems that you don't want them to. So, yeah, and then there's also a place where you can add additional punctuation characters if you want to, say, break up on semicolons all the time instead of only sentence ending punctuation. You can do that. And yeah, so some different settings there as well. And let me finish by just showing you how you would choose a Glyssen script. So if you have exported a Glyssen script, you can import it here and HearThis. And then you'll notice that at the top of the read and record screen, there's some additional controls. And this is where you can pick who your actor is and which characters he's going to read. So Jonathan is Jesus, so he doesn't read any other parts. But Aisha does both the part of the Canaanite, Herodias, and servant girl. So let's say Aisha is ready to record the servant girl parts. You pick Aisha, you pick servant girl, and click OK. And now it's going to take it to the one place where the servant girl in the high priest's courtyard speaks. And Aisha can record just that part. And one thing that I recently discovered and was very sad to discover is that the Android app does not work properly yet for Glyssen scripts. So if you have a Glyssen script project, you have to do the recording using HearThis for Windows. And but I do hope that we'll get that fixed sometime soon, because it'd be really nice to be able to say, okay, everybody grab their phone, go record your parts and bring it all back together. And just yeah, so this is the interface for syncing with Android. You just point you install the application on your Android device. You point your camera at this QR code, and if all goes well, it'll just do the syncing between the two devices. All right, questions?
Okay. Thank you, Tom. We got a few more questions. The first one, are Glyssen and HearThis available in Portuguese?
Oops, wrong thing. Here we go. Portuguese. There it is. So, looks like here this is largely available in Portuguese. Yep.
Okay.
Um, let's see. Yep. Yeah, so if you go to the crowd-in site for here this, you can actually see what percentage of it is done. In fact, let me see if I can just do that real quick. So, right. Okay. So for Glyssen, the answer is no. Um, it is 0%.
Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Uh, yeah.
If you export recordings from one computer, can you import them into another computer?
So the export is not for that. The export is really for exporting and publishing. But there is a see how my Portuguese is here. You can create a hear this pack, and you can import a hear this pack. That's what you use for sharing.
Okay.
So if you're used to like the send and receive in Paratext, not that sophisticated, but it does allow you to export from one computer and import into another computer using the hear this pack.
Okay, that answers the next question about that. Okay. Next one. Is there an overall view of the project? What has been recorded? What still needs to be recorded, etc.?
Yeah, so let me so if you are doing if it's a Glyssen project, this is your overview. So in this particular project, the only book that we're doing is Mark. And so you can see that that chapter okay, this oh, right. So if you see the little line underneath here, that means it's been started but not finished. When it's finished, I think it appears all like a green block. Um, let me go back to a non-Glyssen based one here. I think I have a better. I think my Spanish one is maybe a better example of this. Okay, yeah, no, I don't. I thought maybe I had something that was completely recorded, like a whole chapter. I think I did at one time, but I I I use this project for doing all kinds of testing and stuff. So, but yeah, it will show up here when something is completed.
Okay, thank you. Next, when and where will the recording for this webinar? Okay, I'll answer that one. Okay. It'll probably be available next week, is the answer to that one.
And where?
Oh, it'll be on the lintran.net website, the usual space that all the webinars are on to do that. If the Glyssen script has changes, is there a way to see what might needed to be re-recorded?
Um, yeah, so if you import a new Glyssen script into here, this, um, I'm not sure. Here's what I think the answer is. I believe that if you were to export an updated version of the Glyssen script from Glyssen and then import that into here, this, assuming it was actually it correctly detects that it's the same script, um, then the check for problems mode would work and show you what needed to be re-recorded. That is a good question that I would need to do a little bit of poking around to make sure that in fact it can recognize that it's the same Glyssen script. I think it does.
Okay, thank you. Several
Well,
years ago, one of our interns created 3 short training videos on Hear This: setup, essentials, events, tips, and tricks. Though a bit old, much of the content is still relevant. I don't see a question in there.
Yeah, and I think that's just a FYI.
Okay, to that.
um, so for
I
the just a sec for the what I'm looking at on the screen, um, on the left. So does when you do a recording, does hear this capture the state of the text at the moment of recording?
Yes, it
Is
does.
that, wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so if you did some of your recording with a really old version of Hear This, it's been doing this now for 5 years, maybe more. If you did some recording with a really old version of Hear This, one of the things you'll see in Check for Problems is it'll actually say, hey, this was recorded before Hear This kept track of that, and so it can't answer the question of whether it's changed or not, but it will at least let you know that there could potentially be a problem and you need to look at it.
okay. And I have one question that could you speak to the what kind of like equipment you should have for Hear This to produce the best quality?
Yes and no. That is not my area of expertise. There is, if you go to the website, there is, I think, a link that will give you some tips on that. There's lots and lots of experts on that topic um, that have weighed in on it. What I will say for sure, so for kind of for just testing out the software, you can totally use your internal mic on your laptop. For doing any kind of recording that you're going to actually be publishing, don't do that. The fan on your laptop will make noise that will get picked up by your microphone and you'll have a noisy, bad sounding recording. So either use the phone use the Android, hear this for Android and use the built-in microphone on your Android device, or get an external microphone that you can use with your laptop.
Okay. Well, that ends all our questions. So Tom, I'll let you just give us a few closing comments since we have some time.
Okay. Oh, one other thing about that is, if the advantage of a headset is you get a consistent distance from the microphone. So for kind of better audio leveling and things like that, that is one thing that I will say is a headset might work better, uh, especially if you have fidgety recordists like me. Uh,
Okay.
so yeah, and down here where it shows the microphone, you can actually select which device is chosen. Um, Normally speaking, it normally will go to your system default, which I think if you plug in a USB mic, that will just use, and your system probably is configured to like pick that as the default. But you can choose a different one in here. And as you're recording, you'll notice this level, the little meter down here, that shows your level. So it's kind of gives you a visual indication of whether or not you're speaking loud enough. One of the things that I know that Dwayne Troyer would want me to say is that if you're doing a recording, make sure you have a piece of equipment like this and drink water, sips of water frequently.
Okay.
That will avoid lip smacking sounds in your recordings.
Okay, thank you. I just want to, somebody has shared a note of appreciation, Tom, so I want you to hear this. Just a note of appreciation for the many years you and your team have invested in developing these tools. Your work has had a tremendous impact on Bible translation by empowering countless people to participate in scripture recording. Thank you. So I want you to make sure that you heard that.
Thank you. Thank you, Darcy. Appreciate that.
Okay. Well, I think that concludes our seminar, our webinar today. And I just want to, first of all, thank Tom for taking the time for coming to the webinar and presenting both HearThis and Glyssen as well. I also want to thank all the participants for attending this webinar. And I want you to know that our next webinar is going to be on Thursday, July 23rd, next month, obviously. And the topic will be alpha tiles, and Aaron Hempfield will be presenting on that. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.
Yeah. Oh, and let me just say, if you have other questions that come up as you're playing around with it or things that occur to you afterwards, feel free to reach out to me with questions. Happy to try
Okay.
to answer those. And there is a community site also where you can ask questions and get answers from me or from other members of the community.
All right.